This little dough is worth $10,000, and it's made out of beer. I was on a food competition show a few years ago called Best in Dough on Hulu, and we had to make a pizza dough only 1 day in advance, which is a lot shorter than what I usually do, which is 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 days. So I had to come up with a recipe that would have the flavor of multiple days of fermentation, but the time of only 1 day. That's how I came up with this super wet beer dough recipe. And that's why this dough is worth $10,000, because I won. This recipe starts off with 1 can of beer. If you want to know what kind of beer you're gonna use, I mean, there's a million kinds of beer, but I think the best one to go with is something light and easy, like a lager or a pilsner. What I love about using beer in this recipe is that if you're somewhere unfamiliar and their water maybe smells funky, like a lager like this, like Budweiser, always gonna be the same. So we start off with 1 can of beer. I always save a little bit of liquid back in the can so I can add it later in the recipe. Next is the flour. This is 455 grams of flour, which is about 3 3/4 cups. All of it, just dump all of it. Before I start mixing this together, I'm gonna add my yeast on top of my flour. This is just over 2 grams of instant yeast. I mix that stuff together. You'll notice that this is a really wet dough. There's a lot of liquid in this recipe. And that's because I wanted this dough to be ready after 1 day of fermentation and not like my normal 2 or 3. And also I want it to be really, really easy to open. And when it bakes, it's gonna be super light and super airy. It took me, I don't know, like 8 seconds to mix it into this, at which point we're gonna add the salt. This is 12 grams of just fine sea salt. All you need to do is fold that salt in so it starts to the point where I'm gonna add my remaining liquid. That liquid is just gonna help that salt dissolve. I'm just gonna fold this into place. Takes a few seconds. I'm really just trying to make sure all the liquid is dissolved. That's it. So I sweep the dough around the bowl just to pick up any loose bits, and I'll use, this is probably the most high-tech equipment that I'm gonna use in this whole recipe, which is just a bowl scraper so I can get all the good bits off the side. All right, we're gonna cover it, let it sit for 20 minutes. This is gonna require my other high-tech piece of innovation here, a shower cap, so I don't have to use one-use plastic all the time. We gave it 20 minutes just to give time for the flour to absorb all the water, the beer. And at this point, we're ready to finish the mix. The only ingredient I didn't add before that rest was about just over 2 grams of oil. Very, very little oil. And honestly, the oil is only in there just to give a little bit of color and flavor to the dough. This is where we really do the kneading process. This is a super wet dough. Like for the dough nerds out there, this is 75% hydration dough. And what that means is it's way more wet than like standard pizza dough recipes that you usually see. And so to knead it, we don't forcibly knead it with the palm of the hand. Instead, you do this method where you basically pick it up from the bottom and you pull it out, and this is how you mix. This is called the Rubaud method. You usually use this when you're making like really wet doughs for bread, like sourdoughs and things like that. You're gonna knead this for about 5 to 10 minutes until it all comes together, and then we're gonna give it one final 10-minute rest. When we shot that show, Best in Dough, part of the process is we had to make the dough 1 day in advance and then cook it the next day. And so that's why I made a dough recipe that was really wet, because I knew it would ferment quickly, and with beer in it instead of water, so that it would have the flavor of fermentation that you normally get from like 3 days of rise, and I would get it in the 1 day that they gave me. So it's been about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 minutes. I'm gonna scrape down the side of the bowl, and we're just gonna let this sit for about 10 minutes, and then we're gonna come back and ball it. This is gonna make 3 265-gram dough balls. So that's gonna be like 12-inch pizzas. After that 10-minute rest, you just want to pick up your dough and fold it over itself. These folds are just going to build some strength in the dough. It's really helpful to do this when you're working with such a high hydration dough. I'm going to cover this up and just give it another final 10-minute rest. The dough has had its last 10-minute rest, and now we're ready to turn this into dough balls. It's a really wet dough, so even though I don't want it to absorb too much more flour, I do need to sprinkle my surface with a little bit extra flour. I'm using the same flour that I used to make the dough, which in this case is a product called Super Nuvola from a company called Caputo based in Naples. So this is gonna make 3 pizzas. I'm just gonna cut it into 3 even parts. Whew! Sticky. I'm gonna hit it with more flour actually, because this is rail sticky. And to turn this into dough ball, you just gotta work fast. 2 opposite sides apart. Turn it over, and then ball it. Believe it or not, this dough ball is worth $10,000. Now, of course, I've used up all of my dough containers, so I have like nowhere to put them. Because it's so wet, I gotta be really careful with how I stretch it. A dream. It like opens itself. Okay, now man, we gotta be crazy careful with how this works. Barely any stretching is necessary. Wow, I love doing cheese first. I'm going in. Oh, I almost forgot, I wanna do fontina on this one. Layers, cheese, sauce, cheese. Hell yeah. Let's do this the right way. Probably gonna be 5 or 6 minutes. Whew, almost done. Oh yeah, super, super close. 5 minutes later, and this is it. Great color. Ugh, you can't smell it, but the smell is so good. Good charring on the bottom. Oh baby, great bubbles on the edge. Woo! I usually under cheese my pizzas. This tells me I did the right thing today. Yeasty, malty fermentation flavors from the lager. It doesn't taste like beer, but it's the same notes that you get from fermentation are in beer and in pizza dough. A great crunch. I made this dough 1 day in advance. It has the flavor of multiple days. And this dough was the base of my pizza on Best in Dough. And that's why it's worth 10,000 bucks. So this dough is made entirely with beer. And no, you cannot get drunk from it.